Small Changes by Digits 27, Chapter 4, New Goals. Naruto wasn't quite sure when exactly Uncle moved into his house. It was really more of a gradual thing anyway. She would occasionally come over and stay the night to get away from the orphanage, even though Naruto never said that she wasn't welcome. Then, after a few weeks, when she realized Naruto really didn't mind her staying, she began to come more often. Gradually, she began by keeping things in the guest room, scrolls and books from the academy, and even a few clothes. Then one day, when they were both eating breakfast in the kitchen, they simultaneously realized Uncle hadn't gone back to the orphanage in over 2 weeks. Everything she owned was now in Naruto's guest room, which by now was no doubt hers. Naruto promptly realized before even she did. He didn't mind though. It was like having a roommate. He gave her a place to stay where she wouldn't be mistreated, ignored, or abused, and in turn she brought back some of the noise into his life that had left him when his parents died. It only helped that the two had managed to become fast friends in their months at the academy, mostly inseparable in or otherwise outside of class. Theirs wasn't the only bond formed. In those same months, Naruto would repeatedly come over to the Uchiha district and train with either Itachi or Shisui. On occasion, the two would even come over to the Namikaze estate, neither of them mentioning the strange situation of Naruto practically living with Anko. They too became friends, good ones too, and by proxy they became friends with Anko, helping her train as long as it wasn't too inconveniencing. Nowadays, in Naruto's free time, he would either find himself hanging out with Anko or Shisui or training profusely with Itachi. What had started out as a method to help train and find each other's weaknesses to overcome them had become a full-blown rivalry. It was all in good sport though. Outside of the training or the academy, the two would be just as friendly as Naruto was with Shisui. Naruto had tried to introduce the two Uchiha to the wonderful food that was ramen. Yet only Anko really took to it with the same passion that he did. Growing up with food in the orphanage, Anko could find the simplest of dishes more than delicious. Strangely, that seemed to amplify even more to anything Naruto cooked for her. Of course, Anko wasn't an ungrateful or lazy tenant. She pitched in so she would feel she wasn't taking advantage of Naruto. Growing up in somewhat of a communal situation, despite not actually being a part of that community in the orphanage, Anko had picked up the skills of properly wash her own clothes and sometimes even cook for Naruto. The first time she had thought Naruto had been quite violently sick that night, he hadn't even thought that was a possibility with the fox sealed in him, but somehow she had found a way. Over their time spent living together, Naruto taught her how to cook in the same way his mother had him. Eventually her dishes were palatable, yet both agreed it was better when Naruto cooked, not that he minded at all. Their training also kept them busy with their skills, growing in leaps and bounds with each passing day. Sometimes Uncle would look on anxious at him, feeling distant that he really was a genius like his father. She always wanted to shrink away and disappear. He was so bright compared to her, so far ahead of her. However, compared to the rest of their class, she was the fourth ranked student behind Susui and Itachi, and Naruto always switched places for top rank. She had found her own, a slightly less serious rivalry with the same brown-haired Inuzaka she had fought in their first sparring session. Hana, as she had found she was called, they would be mock enemies in class, always competing against one another, generally with Uncle coming out on top. It did push the girl to train harder though, surprisingly, reaching out beyond her limiting clan techniques, although she still wasn't anywhere near Naruto, Itachi, or Shisui. Over time, Naruto opened up more with his emotions, slowly breaking down the wall that had been built when his parents died. He shared more with Uncle and eventually with Itachi and Tsusui as well. He still hadn't told anybody about the burden he carried, but he thought he eventually would. He just hoped they wouldn't think differently of him. Anko too shared more and more of her experiences growing up, of the orphanage, and of her brief time with the Aoi. They were happy as a group and it stayed that way throughout the year. Eventually, their comfortable equilibrium was broken by a knock on the door of all things. Naruto and Uncle were out in the back of the house, training as usual, seeing as they had just gotten back from the academy. Naruto heard the door and held up a hand to stop, quickly jogging through the house to the front door. When he opened it, he was surprised to see the Hokage standing there, smiling down at the young redhead. He hadn't seen Hiruzen since the memorial service almost 6 months earlier, or at least they hadn't spoken. "Hello, Naruto. I thought I would come by, see how you were getting along," the Hokage said gently. Naruto smiled politely, stepping aside to allow the older man to enter, which he did. Hiruzen smiled as he gazed around the house. Having visited more than a few times before and after Naruto's birth, he noted happily that it was well kept, even if a few articles of clothing were strewn across furniture now and again. He just didn't know those weren't Naruto's. It at least told him that the boy hadn't gone into any kind of depression over his parents' deaths like he had feared. He was also happy to hear that Naruto was top of the class, even if he shared that space with the Uchiha clan heir, really to be expected though from the Minato-san. That told him he hadn't neglected his training at all. Even reports of him visiting the Uchiha compound and making friends and all, Hiruzen was rather glad. He was very busy in the last few months dealing with the aftermath of the attack and didn't have time to visit Naruto, so it was heartwarming to see he was doing just fine. However, he didn't expect to walk into the house, only to see a young purple-haired girl walking in from the back door, looking at the Hokage first curiosity, then in surprise. Hiruzen raised an eyebrow at the scene, scanning the house again as he took note of all the slightly feminine clothing dotted around. He turned back around to Naruto, but the boy simply walked past him, smiling at Uncle, but moving into the kitchen to prepare some tea, as his mother had taught him to when entertaining guests. "Hello, Uncle. Is it?" The Hokage had made a note to know every face in his village. The young girl was no exception. Uncle just nodded quickly and respectfully. Some of Naruto's polite personality managed to rub off on her slightly. "It's good to see you." Uncle smiled a little nervously, never having spoken to the Hokage before, even when the fourth was still alive. "And you, Hokage-sama?" she said, with awkward stillness laden in her voice. Hiruzen just waved a hand, dismissing the formal suffix. After he had retired he had hoped to get rid of it, as well as a certain amount of paperwork. "Please, child, no need for the pleasantries. I am no more important to this village than anybody else." Uncle nodded slowly, obviously not believing the overly humble statement, but following him as they both walked into the kitchen anyway. Hiruzen was mildly surprised when he found Naruto already laying out 3 cups of steaming tea, smiling pleasantly at the Hokage and Uncle. "Very kind of you, Naruto." The redhead simply nodded as he sat down at the table. "Might I ask why you're visiting Hokage-sama?" Hiruzen sighed, knowing it would be a lost battle to try and get Naruto to treat him with anything but the utmost politeness. His father was exactly the same, even when he had been Hokage himself. "I just thought I would come and see how you're getting along with your studies, friends, and the like," he said. Friends, and he made sure to glance in Uncle's direction, watching the girl as she sipped her tea like it was the most normal situation in the world. Naruto just smiled as he settled back in his chair. His defenses really had come down with Uncle's help. He was smiling a lot more now, not like he used to, but more. "Please, Hokage-sama, you have records of all of our progress, updated monthly. If you wanted to know, you could simply flick through my file." The Hokage nodded with a smirk of his own. Naruto was sharp like his father, but with just a hint of cheekiness he got from his mother. "Ah, but it's nothing like hearing from the source." Naruto nodded with a smile, admitting that small fact. "I guess I have been keeping up with the training schedule my father had planned for me while also staying ahead of my studies. As you probably know, I'm top of the class along with my friend Itachi." The Hokage nodded, indeed knowing this beforehand, and he was curious about it. "Tell me, how exactly did that happen? I knew your mother was very well acquainted with Mikoto Uchiha, but before you started at the academy I thought you had limited interaction with them at best." Naruto nodded. In fact, he had limited interaction with children his age period. He approached me at lunch on our second day with a lunch prepared by his mother. We walked and became friends. We trained together every so often too. I think he sees me as somewhat of a rival. I see him the same way. Hiruzen smiled as he sipped his tea. A rivalry was always good to push students harder as long as it didn't get too out of hand. Very good. And I assume you met Shisui through him? Naruto shook his head with his own smirk. It felt somewhat good to have information the Hokage didn't, no matter how inconsequential. No, we became friends after the first sparring session of the academy. He likes to have a partner who can keep him on his toes, but doesn't have the same style of fighting as him. The Hokage nodded, somewhat surprised at how civil and mature Naruto could be as he talked. In his opinion, it was nothing how a six boarding on 7-year-old should be, but there was little he could do about the strange preconditions. Finally, Hiruzen turned his gaze to Uncle. The girl still sipping away at her tea slowly, so far staying out of the conversation. "And how did you two meet?" Naruto just chuckled as Uncle smiled sheepishly before she explained about her unconventional arrival at the academy on her first day and seeing Naruto climb up the building. If Hiruzen was surprised that Naruto was already proficient with the tree climbing exercise, he didn't show it. He might have thought if he knew that wasn't the extent of Naruto's chakra control exercise. Hiruzen, however, seemed concerned with the living arrangement, and while understanding it made both their lives less lonely, he still had to be the adult in the situation. Naruto, as much as it pains me to say this, after hearing just how friendly you two have become, Uncle cannot continue to live with you. Both kids looked up at the man in shock and disbelief. Uncle, especially, she didn't want to leave. For the first time in her life since she was little, she was happy, and it was mainly thanks to Naruto. The redhead was also distressed about this turn of events. What? Why? Hiru's inside arguments with children, especially those as stubborn and mature as Naruto, were always difficult. Naruto, she is in the legal care of the orphanage. That is her home. Uncle huffed loudly at that, nearly dropping her teacup as she crossed her arms over her chest. That place will never be my home. Hiruzen sighed again, trying to get the right meaning across in his words that would get through to the two kids who had obviously grown very attached. While you may think that way, it is still the orphanage's obligation to take care for you, and by living here you make that impossible for them. Uncle still didn't look happy. In fact, she only grew more irritated. So what? I've been living with Naruto for 3 months and the orphanage did nothing. They're probably glad I'm gone. Hiruzen frowned at that. However, unnoticeably, he should have been contacted if a child had gone missing from the orphanage for that long. Also, the fact that Naruto had not only cared for himself but another child as well wasn't exactly good news, even if it did show his maturity in a new light. Come on, Hokage-sama, it's not like we're hurting anybody. If anything, everybody is happier this way. This house is too big for just me anyway, and I don't mind having Uncle live here. He shot an apologetic look at the girl before continuing. And from what Uncle tells me, her experience in the orphanage wasn't ideal. Here she feels safer, and with us training together, she is improving at the academy as well. Hiruzen sighed. He agreed with the same unabating passion and logic as both his parents. It was like talking to Minato himself if he was shorter and a redhead. I can see the benefits, Naruto, but there is a reason there is protocol and systems in place. If Uncle's experience was, as you say, less than ideal, there are people she is supposed to go to. He turned and addressed Uncle directly, not including in those of people, despite how good they're to confide in, are your fellow academy students. Uncle just seemed to shrink in her chair slightly under the Hokage's warm but undoubtedly powerful gaze. Naruto didn't really feel like giving up on this though, as his mother wouldn't. Well, isn't there some way she could come and live here properly then? Uncle looked up and around in surprise at the redhead. Before now, both had just sort of accepted their living situation without really discussing it. This was the first time either of them had openly admitted to wanting it like this, and it made her feel a little warmer instead of how somebody actually wanted her around. Hiruzen just sighed, putting a hand to his forehead in both exasperation and thought. Until Anko becomes a fully fledged adult or has a legal guardian, she is under the care of the system. Naruto narrowed his eyes at this, frustrated that the Hokage kept coming back to that same point. Then how can I become her guardian? Hiruzen looked up from his palm, genuinely surprised Naruto was fighting so hard for this. He didn't know if it was genuine affection for Anko or just his inherent stubborn streak in his Uzumaki genes. You need to be an adult to be made someone's guardian, Naruto. Naruto finally smiled in victory, even though Hiruzen had no idea what was going through the boy's mind. Then as soon as I become a shinobi, I'm eligible, right? Hiruzen's eyebrow shot up, and incredibly, as he finally caught on to what Naruto was thinking. If I pass the Genin exams this year, then I can legally be made Anko's guardian, and she can stay with me. Hiruzen finally sighed as he nodded slowly, only increasing the smile that spread across Naruto's features. Then just you watch. I'll pass the exam. Believe it. Hiruzen tried to keep his mirth from showing as he stood up, walking towards the door with a smile. Very well. In the meantime, I think it would be too much to allow Anko to stay with you. Call it a trial run. Naruto was a little shocked and relieved at the Hokage's concession as he followed the older man to the door. But be warned, if you don't pass the Genin exams, then Anko will have to return to the orphanage. Naruto just nodded with determination, even as the Hokage left, leaving the two shinobi in training with a look of thoughts. Naruto returned to the kitchen where he found Anko just staring at him with a mix of awe and gratitude. Why did you fight so hard for me? I mean, you got out of your way just for me. It's not like I'd be disappearing. Aren't I just a lot of trouble? Naruto only smiled kindly as he gently hugged the shocked girl, pulling away with a smile. You're my friend, and you want to stay, right? He began to walk back outside to the training ground, not forgetting what the Hokage had entrusted with his visit. Plus, it would be way too quiet around here if you left. Uncle smiled until she got the other meaning in Naruto's words as a playful scowl made its way onto her face. Hey! The months passed even more quickly after that, as Naruto really threw himself deep into an all-consuming regimen of training. He never forgot Anko though, making sure he always had time for his friends through his busy schedule. He mainly focused on chakra control through though using every technique in the book for one reason, the clone technique. It was supposed to be the simplest jutsu in a shinobi's arsenal, requiring literally the bare minimum of chakra to form. Too little. He found that with the fox widening his chakra pathway every day, control became more and more difficult. Eventually, he struggled to lower his output to the required levels, and eventually it became impossible. He overloaded the clones he made, and they came out sickly and useless. He just couldn't use that little chakra in his jutsu anymore, even with all the control exercises he went through. He overloaded the clones he made, and they came out sickly and useless. He just couldn't use that little chakra in his jutsu anymore, even with all the control exercises he went through. He sighed, knowing that all but the highest ranked genjutsu would also be out of the realm of his learning, and without working his way from basics, the A-ranked ones would be impossible. Surprisingly, it was Uncle who finally gave him a solution of sorts. She was watching him train, trying again and again at producing a healthy clone. She simply suggested that instead of using a small amount of chakra to produce one, he could just mold a large amount of chakra and divide that to produce many clones at once. Naruto had stood stoically flabbergasted at the simplicity of the situation, asking if it was still Anko he was talking to. Of course, after earning himself a thrown rock at the head and a good laugh, Uncle chased him around the training field. He put his hand into the correct sign, molded the smallest amount of chakra he could before dividing it into the required amount. Uncle just watched in amazement as 20 perfectly healthy and identical clones sprouted out of clouds of smoke, as did Naruto. He jumped in victory, finally having mastered each of the basic three jutsu he needed to pass the Genin exam. After that, the rest of their academy year flew by, and before any of them really realized it, it was already over. They all waited on the last day as the teacher ran through some boring speech about how proud he was and how they would go on to be the best class he had ever taught. Finally, he asked if there were any students who thought they could take the game test now. Surprisingly, only three people raised their hands: Naruto, Itachi, and Shisui. Naruto turned, blinking in surprise as he looked at Uncle, her arm not raised. She just smiled at him sadly, looking down at the desk as she fiddled with her hands. I never could quite get the hinge down. I just don't think I'm ready yet. Naruto's eyes softened in understanding before hardening as the teacher asked them to come with him for their evaluation. He shot one look at Anko as he joined Itachi and Sushi walking out of the room. She just gave him a thumbs up as he smirked, knowing that he had to do this. Uncle waited behind after class, sitting on a swing somebody had hung on a tree in the school grounds. She saw Itachi, then Sushi both emerge from the building holding their headbands. They smiled at her and waved before running off to tell their parents. Happily tying their bands around their foreheads, she waited a bit longer before Naruto emerged, his face a mask of neutrality. She jumped off the railing and ran over as soon as she saw him, covering the distance in a flash. So, did you do it? She wasn't even sure why she doubted for a second as he smirked. A broad grin crossed his features as he pulled an arm from behind his back, showing her his new forehead protector. Of course! Uncle grinned as she hugged him in congratulations, pulling him away from the school, which earned her a confused look. Come on, we need to celebrate, she said excitedly. Naruto just smiled again as he allowed the girl to pull him away, but not before he tied his headband around his arm. He felt as though he had achieved the first part of his goal to surpass his father and make his parents proud. Up on the roof of the academy, two figures watched all of this, one with a beaming grin, the other with a more calculating smirk. Interesting crop this year, huh? Orochimaru turned to his teammate with a vaguely amused expression. Are you saying that because of your godson? Jiraiya just smiled down at the scene of Anko pulling the slightly taller redhead away with her, a calm but happy smile on his features. How can I not be? The youngest to graduate the academy since the boy my student trained. Kakashi, even then it was only because of the war. Orochimaru just nodded along to his teammate, observing the young girl alongside the Namikaze. Yes, interesting crop indeed. Naruto arrived at the training ground he had been designated since nice and early the next day. He had found it quite amusing when he found out he couldn't get drunk. They had found out when Anko had decided to take full advantage of the fact that Naruto was legally an adult. Anko surprisingly had taken to drinking quite well. Naruto also didn't mind the flavor of sake, even if he couldn't experience the other effects. Uncle, on the other hand, had no such luck, so he left her groaning in her bed, sleeping off the effects of her first drink. He greeted Itachi and Sushi pleasantly. They too had come early in order to meet their Jonin sensei. They were surprised then when a young man suddenly melted out of the shadows of a nearby tree. He was roughly 30 years old, with his dark hair tied back in a ponytail. His eyes had black markings around them, making him look quite tired, and he had the slight hint of a beard on his chin. Other than that, he wore the standard Jonin outfit, if in slightly if in slightly darker colors than usual, and bore the generally laid-back posture of most Nara clan members. Great, I finally take on a Genin squad and they send me a bunch of kids. How bothersome. He didn't pay attention to the tick mark that suddenly appeared over Naruto's head and the genuinely annoyed expression on Sushui's face. Itachi managed to stay quite calm as usual, though inside he was slightly offended by the situation. I'm Insui Nara, your Jonin instructor. If you pass my test, Naruto was a little surprised. There was another test, but he said nothing, allowing the Naruto to explain. You're here because you managed to pass what you thought was the Genin exam, but I can send you straight back to the academy if I believe you don't have what it takes to be on a squad. It's all really quite bothersome, but I'm overdue to have a team, and you three are what I was left with. Again he got the same responses, Naruto getting agitated, Suisui getting annoyed, and Itachi, well, he was Itachi. Basically, if you want to be Genin, you have to land a single hit on before he could finish his sentence, Naruto had shot forward in a blur of red, forcing Ensui to suddenly duck back as the boy sailed over his head. The lazy Naruto blinked in surprise before ducking to the side again to avoid a fast spinning kick. The boy's speeds were very impressive for a kid straight out of the academy, at 7 no less. Hell, they were above average for a Chunin. It made him wonder just how hard the kid trained. Likewise, he didn't get much more time to explain before Naruto suddenly dived out of the way, revealing Tsushri behind him, hands in a tiger seal. Insui only had a moment to think before he had to dive out of the way of an enormous fireball that would have burned him to a crisp. Unfortunately, that put him straight in the path of Itachi, Sharingan blazing as he quickly tried to intercept the man. Insui easily batted the boy away, and before anyone else could try anything, he crouched with his hand in the rat seal. Before any of the new Genin could do anything, they were suddenly stuck in place. Looking down, they all saw their shadows linked to their senseis. As he stood up, they all found they copied the action, settling into the man's natural slumping posture. Bothersome. At least you all have decent teamwork. However, like I was saying, you need to land a hit on me. He pulled out a stop clock from his pocket as the three 7-year-olds copied the phantom action. In 1 hour. If you do that, then you are officially getting of the leaf. And with that the man promptly melted into the shadows, disappearing before the three were released from his possession technique. They just stood there a moment getting their bearings as they regrouped, nodding at one another as they knew what to do. They took off into the forest, moving in the direction they knew would be best to hide in. None of them were particularly trackers, but Naruto's ears were honed to the point where he could accurately tell the difference between animal and human footprints. Using that, he took the lead, listening out for any signs of their sensei. Suishu took the middle as he had the most powerful jutsu in his arsenal, being able to create a larger fireball than Itachi. Itachi naturally took up the rear, using his Sharingan to make sure they didn't miss anything. Eventually, Naruto caught onto something, raising a hand to halt their small group on a branch. He looked at Itachi, who just nodded, having also noticed the signs of somebody coming through here. His Sharingan picked up the minute details. They quickly formulated a plan as they slowly approached the clearing they were sure their sensei was hiding in. Seishui stood on a hill branch looking down over the clearing as he began to mold his chakra, drawing in as deep as breath as he could muster, and Sui simply hid behind a tree in the clearing, hoping the kids weren't good enough trackers to find him. That way he wouldn't have to take them as a team and he could just go back to lazing about and taking on occasional bothersome missions when necessary. However, it quickly became evident that wasn't going to be the case when his eyes widened and he forced Chakra into his feet. He managed to get up in time to avoid the massive fireball that obliterated the trees he had just been in, leaving only scarced and charred blackened earth behind. He blinked dumbfoundedly in surprise before he had to suddenly dodge a fist that would have struck him straight in the face. He swiveled on his heel, staring straight into the one Tomo Sharingan of Itachi as the young Uchiha narrowed his eyes. His attacks came fast, but his counterattacks came even faster. It didn't particularly press the experienced Jonin as the boy was still just beginning, but it didn't leave him much room to think. Quickly the Uchiha was joined by his clansmen, the two teaming up and covering the other's weaknesses. This actually put the lazy Nara on edge, forcing him to think quickly to avoid the well-timed and almost choreographed moves that slowly forced him into the clearings. Even if neither had actually landed a hit yet, he was so preoccupied with fighting the two of them and trying to prevent them from landing a blow that he almost forgot about the last member of the group. He could only look up in time to see Naruto falling from a high branch, his face cocked back for a blow. Ensui suddenly grabbed Sushui, using the boy's lack of Sharingan to his advantage as he pulled on his arm, swinging the boy up and throwing him at the approaching Naruto as if it had been planned all along, and in a very impressive display of mid-air acrobatics, Sushui was just reached out a hand, grabbing onto Naruto. The Uchiha twisted his hand in the air, pulling Naruto down as he did so, and only adding to the boy's already impressive speed. Already caught off guard, Insui tried to twist out of the way, but Naruto just managed to clip the man's shoulder, owning them the hit they had been working for. He span, expecting another attack, but quickly realized the three genin were just standing there, looking rather amused as Insui sighed tiredly. All right. I'll give you that you three are impressive to land a hit on me. He suddenly became very serious, more so than looked natural on a Naruto's face. You three are now getting the leaf, fully fledged shinobi and legal adults, and as such, you are now expected to behave as such. You will report to the same training ground tomorrow at 7 for missions. For now, you have the rest of the day off. He relaxed again, returning to his slumping posture. Congratulations, even if it is incredibly bothersome. The three newly minted genin just smiled. They knew they were going to have fun with this. End of chapter 4.